Okay, how does that look? Does that look good?
Looks great.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. So hello, everyone. Thank you so much for Kelly, Rebecca, Saima for inviting me. I'm feeling so excited and honored to be speaking with you all today, both in person. Thank you for being here. I know today was raining earlier and it could be a hard journey coming here, and also appreciate the people who are participating online. This presentation today is going to involve a talk that goes for the first hour, 2 to 3, and then we're gonna ease into a workshop, which is 3 to 4. I'm gonna show, talk a little bit more about the schedule just in a second. So both of these sessions are available both in person and online. So just so you know, for those of you who are online right now, if you want to join the workshop, you can definitely stay. We're just using the same Zoom link. Okay. Also, if anyone have any trouble hearing me, like in the room or over Zoom, please just express that. If you're on Zoom, express that over chat so that Zoe here can help us navigate the situation. So Consentful Software Design is the topic of discussion today. I'm really excited to be talking about this because for me, this is quite a new and exciting, but also, a very unknown journey when it comes to like thinking about how to reconsider some of the basic possibilities of network software and creating like communication methods online using the frameworks that we have right now, which aren't necessarily, constructed or built with the thoughts of consent in mind and thinking about how do we use like existing technology and repurpose that, or sometimes creating something new from scratch to like create this kind of design that is value aligned. So I think for me, the goal of both the talk and the workshop today is not to sell Togethernet, which is the project I'm going to talk about. I'm not trying to sell it to you. What I'm really trying to do is I want to share the things I have learned through building Togethernet for the last year and share my takeaway with you. And hopefully, that can, trigger some new idea or inspire some new thoughts or criticism. That's all welcomed. So a couple of disclaimers. I do not claim to be an expert in specialized forms of consent. So even though, yes, I did make a software that really considers consentful communication in the online context, I do not come from, like a specialized field. Let's say like, there are people who are like specially trained in say sex and intimacy consent, or maybe like medical consent, and all those types of consent are very nuanced and very important, and they have their own sets of considerations, and it's all contextual. And I do not come from that background. Instead, I am just someone who is really invested and interested and lost, all at the same time on trying to figure out what it means for a artist and a designer, living in this day and age, creating software in a network context, and how can I do better, and what can I contribute, essentially. And so, I think what another disclaimer I want to make is that, through the whole last year of creating the software, one thing that I also learned is that from a kind of like purely technical software engineering point of view, there's no magic bullet when it comes to guaranteeing consentful communication, right? There's this kind of ideas in tech industry sometimes that, better design is going to produce better society, and that idea had basically debunked for me like completely over the last year. It really has to be a collaboration between, the designer and their considerations of how to create a more consentful environment, and also the communities who's using it. The communities and the people have to care about consent for that to really happen, in a way that's desired. And also, when it comes to like thinking about consentful communication online, we are, like continuously reminded of how language is, you know, beautiful, but also trickily ambiguous, right? Language continues to be ambiguous and slippery and constantly evolving, especially in like an online space. And so what, you know, the kinds of things that one might be able to monitor or you know, figuring out what is consentful and what is not consentful sometimes lives on a spectrum rather than a binary. It really depends on the situation. It's very contextual. And so I think that for me, thinking about designing a consentful software is really, I approach it in a very holistic way, in the sense of like thinking about how we can do our best, try our best for every single design decision that we make inside the software to be aligned with a set of values and a set of conduct. And how we can focus on creating an environment that will have more likelihood of you know, letting consentful interaction happen rather than, you know, the opposite. and so I'll talk about like a couple of things that I've discovered along the ways. And I think lastly, you know, another thing that I want to mention is I think it's quite important when, you know, if you're using experimental software like this one, or open source software, or if you're doing one yourself, you know, to also kind of like find ways to shift away from like the kind of mentality of being a consumer, you know, which a lot of times like in the US, like being a consumer of technology means like wanting convenience over, you know, considerations and wanting things to happen quickly and easily, rather than like questioning why are things designed a certain way, and is barrier sometimes actually intentional and possibly beneficial for whatever reasons, right? So it's, you know, I think through like the process of creating the software, I was like really confronting with a lot of these very difficult questions that I think prior to even like thinking about consentful software or consentful tech, I might have an easier answer of. And so I'd love to excited to share that with you. So the schedule today, just want to give you an overview and know what to expect. From 2 o'clock to 2:40, we're gonna go through the talk, and we're gonna spend 10 minutes for Q&A. And I hope to take a 10 minutes break, especially for those who are hoping to stay for both. So you have a tea break, water break, walking break, bathroom break, and we return for the workshop. And towards the end, we'll have a Q&A again. All of these sessions are delivered through a hybrid format. And yes, good call, thank you. And so, yes, I think the Zoom captioning, live captioning is working right now. So if you have any other needs, by any chance, please express that in the chat, so that Zoe can help out with that. Okay, so invitation to ask questions. So here are 3 ways that I can think of for both in-person and online audience to ask questions. If you have other ideas, please let me know. But the first way is, you know, if you have any questions throughout any part of the lecture, just raise your hand. I'll try to keep my eyes over here, and I think Zoe can help me keep an eye on like the little Zoom hand online, and also ask questions over the chat feature. Also, you can leave your questions at the Q&A session. Please do not feel like, you know, worried or anxious about interrupting me. I love being interrupted, especially in this context. Okay, and so to get into Togethernet, it is an open source software that invites 10 or less participants to build community archives through practices of consent. So they're like, basically like, it's a pretty packed sentence. There are 3 different like keywords that I want to just like, want to kind of pay special attention here for a moment. First, it's open source. How does making an open source software that other people can remix and reuse and alter and edit might, you know, might like influence the way we think about consent, like, or maintaining consent, right? So if someone can remix the software, how do we maintain consent or how do we, actually encourage people to customize the software to their needs so that actually like better suit the kind of consent that they need in their community. The second question is that we, at this moment, we set it so that it's 10 or less participants, which is very like anti-social media, right? It's like every time I show this, we're like, oh, what if we have like 50 people, or what if we have like 20 people? And so there's a lot of thoughts that went into that too, and I'll get into that more later when I talk about like some of the design decisions. The third part is thinking about practices of consent, and that in itself is so broad and so nuanced and so contextual that I think it's one of those things that just require continuous, constant interrogation. And so I don't want to present Togethernet as something that I have personally made. This was a collaborative group project. I was a lead artist on the project, meaning I led most of the creative decision, visual decision, as well as the kind of like project management and pushing forward of the project into the world, like what I'm doing with you now. But we also have Yaqing Wen, who essentially single-handedly built the whole software in collaboration with me, who's the lead software engineer. And we also have Nema Gidere, who is an incredible writer and basically crafted all the words that you can see both inside and outside of the software. Inside meaning like every single button, every single menu option, description of features are written by Nema, or at least vetted and copy edited by Nema. And also we have this amazing document called the Code of Consent, which is Togethernet's version of user agreement. And Nema also was fully responsible, amazingly responsible for that. And we also have our advisor, Lauren Lee McCarthy, who was the creator and the prior project lead for open source software P5JS. And Lauren really had demonstrated their amazing ability to create an inclusive, diverse open source community, which is quite rare in the open source world, by the way. So I really wanted to talk to Lauren throughout the whole time of the project development to see, just to learn like what are some ways to start a community, because a tool is kind of meaningless without people. A software, no matter how beautifully designed, it can really, the courses of how the software plays out and how it shifts, how it gets updated, really changes depending on who are using it and what community is supporting it and giving it feedback, right? And so we're very explicit about with the software on who should use this and who shouldn't use this, and this for us is part of thinking about communicating through a consentful lens. Like with the project, so who should use this? We really think of it as artists, designers, organizers, technologists, researchers, educators, and students who are interested in these three particular things. So either one, exiting surveillance capitalism, two, consentful communications, three, creating community-owned digital archives. At this point, the software is quite experimental. It's a little fragile. It still needs a lot of research. So I think that it's, at this very moment, it's best suited for people who have research interests and are interested in thinking through some of the problems we're tackling with together with us. Who shouldn't use this? Togethernet by default exposes public IP addresses in the initial process when it makes connections. And I'll get into that more a little later, which means that this is not suitable for individuals working with highly sensitive issues and who are concerned with targeted surveillance, and also individuals who isn't invested in constant engagement with others, right? So we really, I think one part of it is a more technical side, people who might not be a good fit, are people who might, be a journalist or an activist or someone who just are dealing with sensitive content on a day-to-day basis. This experimental software is not meant to be a replacement of a software like Signal, right? Where like hundreds of software developers and people are like checking that software every single day. So it goes through a peer review process, and it's made sure that the integrity of its privacy is being maintained by many people. This is a very small project created by 2 to 4 people. So it's really, it's really not, we're not there yet. And so to kind of like give you a quick software overview, and actually I really don't like saying the word quick because I think, especially through like creating this work, I really realize, the kind, like how much our culture normalize like speed, like, fast productivity, normalizing saying yes because saying no is not slow everything down, right? And so I am yet going to give you a software overview. When you enter the software, the moment you open the software, you are going to see a screen that describes the privacy scenario that you're about to enter. So this was one of the kind of, I would say one of the like invention that Togethernet came up with, which is conventionally when one is being handed a piece of technology, like the software company or the software engineer might say, hey, this is fully private. It gives you like end-to-end private encryption, expecting that people might know what that means, right? So if one isn't invested in these technical terms, these words are extremely inaccessible. And so what we were trying to do is not only we want to make these terminologies very accessible or these descriptions very accessible, but we also wanted it to be creative. We also wanted it to feel very warm. We also wanted to, be able to exit like the frame of staying purely technical, And so here what you're seeing is we created this privacy scenario that's called sitting at the park. So this is the kind of like level of let's say possible risk and threat or safety that one might encounter using the peer-to-peer network here. So the description is you and a friend are sitting in your usual corner of the park on a picnic blanket, speaking among each other. Right, so down there in the orange text, we kind of offer like the technical description. So in the ephemeral channel, your conversations are private and encrypted by default. However, the underlying Webrtc protocols does leave some exposure. And so like basically what we're trying to do was finding real life scenario that everybody can relate and like use that to map onto some of the technical like levels of benefits versus threats. And so yes, even though like the software is using an encrypted channel, but if someone somewhere really wants to track you down, they still can. Similar to if you're talking to a friend in public, if someone really wants to, intentionally look for you and record you from behind, they still can, right? So I think these were like the kinds of like innovations with language that we're trying to create. So also like really trying to think about the speed of software, which I'll speak a little bit more later. So if you click continue and that yes, you do want to participate, what you end up with is you get into this interface. You appear as an avatar. There's no logging system in Togethernet. Meaning, you don't have any username or password or email or anything like that stored on the web. So you enter in as anonymous, what we call peer, or you can think of it as user. And you can move around. And of course, you can rename yourself depending on situations, right? You might want to like put your own like real name, or you might want to use a pseudonym or a fake name that only your community members knows about. And so here, that'll be my name. And so I could actually write a message. And when I write that message, I can open it by walking right next to it. And in order to create something such as a thread, I would walk to either one of the four sides of that message and say, this becomes a thread. So it has this kind of like visual quality, like visual representation of conversations. And there were many reasons behind why we ended up going this way. That, if you have any questions, feel free to ask me. I'd love to answer them. But when you are communicating in this channel that we call ephemeral channel, you are talking by default in a peer-to-peer mode. So I'm going to talk a little bit on what that means. Actually, just a second after I talk about the first part. So this software was very largely influenced by this zine called Building Consentful Tech Zine by Yuna Lee and Dann Toliver. The zine was really inspiring because they did something really specific, which is they had the foresight of using something called the Fry's model, which stands for freely given, reversible, informed, enthusiastic, specific, which is a model of thinking about sex and intimacy consent, originally proposed by the Planned Parenthood. They took that and thought about, wait, how does this apply to data privacy? And they started talking about how we all have a digital body, right? Different kinds of data. Some of them are biodata, right? Like now it's becoming increasingly normalized for us to just scan our face or use our fingerprint to log in or to get through different kinds of systems. Those not just biodata, but also your personal data, where you live, your birthday, your health data, and whatnot. Those data are a portion, a fragment of our digital body, and they're living, spreading across the web, being, either being protected or being resold and being scraped and reused and regenerated in different ways that might be unbeknownst to you. And so what Yuna Lee and Dann Toliver were talking about was, okay, we have this knowledge. We have this knowledge of rights. We have from the human society, from this community, from this society in the United States, we have actually developed a matrix and a history of understanding how to ask for consent and how to maintain and think about consent through these terminologies. How can we use this in the digital space? How would that, if I design a software, design a piece of technology through this matrix, how is that going to change all of my design decisions, right? So the freely given idea here is that consent should be completely fully given to you without you having to ask, right? Like you should by default have full agency and rights and control over your digital body and data that belongs to you. And reversible is the idea that any decisions that you make on the software should be reversible. So if I today decide that, okay, I'm gonna give my facial data to Apple tomorrow, I should be able to take it back and not letting them store any copies of it, right? So that reversibility should be absolute and 100%. And informed meaning, informed ended up to be like the like keyword that I dive into the most for this software so far. And that is talking about informing the user the benefits and risk of using this software. And it's actually very, very hard. like once I begin. And you might already have seen this a lot. When you buy a tech product, even if the tech product is trying to be ethical and is actually doing a lot of good things, the way it's sold to you, a lot of times still follow that kind of like techno-utopian Silicon Valley language, right? The software you're using is fully private, traceless, like without ever really like, bother to tell you how it's traceless, because it's, it's assuming that's too technical for the customers, right? And so for me, that part is hard in the sense of like thinking about what are ways to really make those technical language accessible. And how can, I think, I like actually talk to my mom a lot. I was like, my user testers, I mean, Mom, do you get this? Like, do you understand what I'm writing here? And, I have to go through many different revisions to really get to the level of thinking that, okay, like this is maybe, I want the users of the software to have enough say to be able to sit at the table with the software engineers and talk about the same issues. That is like the kind of access that I'm imagining. And we're very far from that. And so enthusiastic, I would say that is quite, it's not super easy with the software, in the sense of like making sure that you like create a scenario where people are like excited or enthusiastic to use something, especially in a software context. It's only for me, it's aspiration. It's not something you can really control or really program. And specific. So specific relates to the idea that if a consumer or if a user agree to one thing, it doesn't mean that they agree to the subsequent thing, right? Just because you agree to give your location data this time, doesn't mean that you want to give your location data again when you open the app again, right? So there should be, and iPhones are actually doing some work on that recently, right? So now you have the ability of being more nuanced and more specific, of like letting the app use my location one time or always or never, right? So that's the kind of specificity we're talking about. Like how do we make sure that this way of thinking is being applied across the board with every single decision that's being made? And so returning to talking about freely given, I guess this is like where I pivot into talking about like how the Fry's model had influenced the way the software was designed. Again, I want to say that we approach it holistically, meaning that we tried our best, right? There are things about existing network technology that is not a quick fix. For instance, if you set up a server and want to host your community archive on it, most of these servers are going to belong to Amazon. There's no very quick way to create a server that you self-host in your house or self-host at your organization. Those things have a lot of technical barriers. And it's not something that, it would take me decades to even begin to kind of break that down into a more accessible format. But I think what we're able to achieve in terms of thinking about freely given is by choosing to work with a peer-to-peer protocol. So using a peer-to-peer, does anyone here know I've heard of peer-to-peer communication? Yes. Do you want?
No, I've never heard of it.
Oh, okay. Sorry, that was a reason. Okay, I can talk about it a little more. So peer-to-peer connection is inherently different from most of the messengers you might be using day to day through large tech monopolies. So this is kind of one of those classic chart of the different types of network. It is meant to be a pretty a soft introduction to it. There's a lot of nuances when you dive a little deeper, but when we communicate messengers such as Facebook, Instagram, Slack, Discord, as long as you could log into a platform, a communication space, and be able to see others people's messages that have been posted, in the past, or log into a communication between you and your friend from a different device, from a new device, and be able to see the record of the past. This means that that messages is being stored somewhere at a central server, right? So in this case, this would be the Facebook server. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot this touch screen. Okay, sorry. So that's the central server right here. So this will be like, you know, Facebook, Instagram, Discord server that's storing your messages, and each and every one of the computer connected to it are just continuously to send messages to the server to save, so that whoever else wants to read those messages will log into that, you know, like workspace or platform or communication channel to be able to like retrieve it, right? There's other kinds of networks. And honestly, you know, there's a lot of hype around like the idea of decentralization. But you know, with like NFT or cryptocurrency and such, but these ideas have been existing since the start of the internet. Like these ideas have always been running like in parallel since the very beginning. And there have always been like different opinions and different like believers of like what kind of internet we should be building since the very start. And so decentralized is essentially the kinds of, it's closer to like the kinds of network that Togethernet is building. So the idea is that instead of having a centralized server, a centralized like computer hard disk that's like saving all of our information, we each share each other's information collectively. So the way Togethernet works is that, I'm gonna skip this slide for a second. The way it works is that when I send a message to you and you send a message to me, our messages are communicating or transporting directly from my browser to your browser. It doesn't go over a centralized server, gets saved there, and gets sent to you, right? So we are talking directly, almost like we're talking in person, person to person, instead of having every record of our message being saved somewhere. And so that's what a peer-to-peer protocol can offer. When we went over evaluating different possibilities of peer-to-peer protocols, we ended up deciding to use Webrtc. And here's some descriptions to, you know, like just like some of the pros and cons of why we chose this peer-to-peer protocol versus the other one. Ultimately, it's, you know, the decision we made was to think through like the first model. What kind, which protocol have like is closest to what we're looking for. One thing that we were looking at is that, you know, some of these protocols, even though it might be secure, some of them are information is irreversible. So for instance, Scuttlebutt, which is like the icon, the software on the very right, even though it actually offers like a pretty robust way of decentralization, information is irreversible. So there's like a lot of different nuances and like things that, you know, my nerdy brain really like looking at. But essentially we decided to land on Webrtc. The way Webrtc works, and remember at first in the beginning, I did mention that yes, your public IP address is vulnerable when you use the software. Is that, sorry, what's your name? Marie. So Marie, so you and I, we both jump on Togethernet. When we first jump on Togethernet, in order for us to find each other, you know, we have to have a way, like our avatar have to have a way to find each other, because there's no, you know, like because I'm entering the space from my browser, you're entering the space from your browser. It has to be a way for us to connect, right? So that initial connection for you to find me, for me to find you, is through a temporary Togethernet server. And that server essentially collects your IP address, and which, you know, indicates your, it's almost like your like home address for your computer. It indicates your IP address and it indicates my IP address, and it helps us find each other. And so once we exchange our home address for our computers, we're able to then communicate directly from browser to browser, because I can just send my message to you directly because I have your address, right? And so all the messages that gets communicated after that initial exchange of IP address doesn't go through a server. Does that make sense?
Sending a mail, kind of.
It's kind of like sending a mail. Yeah,
It's kind of like sending a mail. Well, sending a mail, there's still involved like, like a postman or a postwoman that would like be able to look at it possibly. So it's a little safer than that. It's actually more encrypted than that. I would say it's closer to, like, sometimes the way I describe to people is that it's closer to if you met someone at the bar and you talk to them, you're like, oh, this is a really interesting person. Like, I really want to stay in touch with this person. You exchange phone number with each other. And from then on, you call each other up and meet up in person and talk to each other. That's a little closer to the level of security, because every one of our browser, if you're using like a modern like Chrome or Firefox browser, they all contain an encryption channel that is actually underutilized and not really used. And so we actually borrow that encryption channel that is built inside of your browser to send these messages back and forth. Okay, so yeah.
So do you mean like that Togethernet server kind of goes away after you've established like the connection from your browser to the other person's browser?
It doesn't go away until everybody close your browser.
Okay.
It gets temporarily set up when someone's in the space, and it closes once like nobody's in there, because it needs to continuously search for new participants.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Just checking I've gotten this correctly. So the server actually just keeps track of your address instead of the messages you're sending. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. So the server is there to exchange address, and that's the only purpose. There are possibilities to hide and to find a way to obscure that initial IP address, but it has to come in like software updates and further development. So it's I think making the experience of making a software was very humbling too, because it made me realize that most software projects and software is never finished. And it was a little bit of a shock. I was like, oh right, it's true. Like any software that I've ever purchased or downloaded and used, they're never really fully done. They're done enough for it to function, right? Like in certain ways. But browser makes their update. Your system operations software makes your update, and a lot of times these updates would actually make the software that someone else has written out of date, right? And so it's a continuous evolving process, and I think it's very frustrating but very cool at the same time for me to think about how temporal it is. But that is the sort of like freely given effort that we have made. And over here, this is what happens. This is one of the key features of the software. It's called consent to archive. So what it does is, okay, so we all communicate through P2P by default. That's not necessarily very helpful, because sometimes we want to save our messages. And so if you remember the initial description, this is a community archiving software, right? And so in order to save our message on the server, we have to go through a very specific process called consent to archive. So this is the button here. If you have hovered over that button, you will see like the description consent to archive. When you click on that button next to a message, you would basically pause the entire space, and everybody would be put into, you can almost think of it as like a mini game, where like they'll be put into a situation to give their consent. So they'll be asked, do you want to give consent to archive this message or not? And that is the point where people would go through a unanimous voting process where they say yes or no. And if a message had indeed been archived, this message will kind of like turn into this mosaic pattern that consists of like the different colored users that have agreed to consent to the message for it to be archived. And that message then actually on the back end gets sent to the database that is hosted on a server of one's choice. So, so this is, this is just like a view of like what the database look like from the back end. Like I access this through terminal. One may or may never have to use, like ever have to access, like looking at the back end of the database. You can totally like delete message or add messages just from the front end. But this is the idea, there's like, it tracks the ID number of the message. So it just like sequentially it starts from 0 and all the way down. It tracks the author who wrote the message and tracks the content. It tracks the name of the room. So the name of the room is kind of works like Slack or Discord. You can kind of name it after a topic. Participant's name is the people who have consented to archive. So it stored these kinds of like basic or information that we thought were probably important to preserve. So that, imagine if you're in a student club, for instance, three of you have met up and made some decisions about what's going to happen with the next event and have all agreed and consented to archive, whatever meeting agenda you had. And other people might enter the space later and want to know who made that decisions, right? And what, who do I talk to if I have questions about those decisions? So those are kind of the things that we thought were important. And also state the time and just some of these like basic timestamp information. And on the front end, once a message has gone to consent to archive, you can like then go into the archival channel and see that message being listed right here. So this over here is the room ID, and down here there's a message, and it shows you who have participated in the archival process. And one of the things that I personally really like, that might not seem to be a big deal, but I think it's really subtle and nice, is that you could actually click on this button right here and like download a HTML version of the archive. And for me, it's really, a lot of like these like software design decision for me is, it's almost like subtly suggesting or subtly like signaling like how to work with data, right? How to like deal with the data, because we could have very easily like written it so that clicking that button would just like port that archive and put it on a Google Doc or something, right? But then that would, that might be very convenient for some people, but that would like really go against, just make the software completely illogical. Like there's no reason to use the software in some ways if it just end up on Google Drive. And so that, downloading an HTML file is really kind of like encouraging like a kind of relationship with technology, a kind of like creative technological process too. I'm like, hey, you could like look through this as HTML page and host it on your own website if you want. This can be a way to decide whether you want to put this data locally or put it online somewhere. And the person has to go through those explicit process to think about it. And we also have a feature called Revoke Consent. So if one were to decide, oh, I give consent, I consented to archive something, but now we talk a little more and I regret, right? That happens a lot in meetings, right? It's like, oh, wait a second, I really don't know anymore. And sometimes I don't always feel like there's enough time or space to like reverse my decision. This is a way to do that. So revoking consent is where you can like go next to that message and click on that button again, which then would actually just completely remove that message from the database. And so that is an example of thinking about like reversibility and reversibleness. And I think the last part I want to focus on before we get into the Q&A is like thinking about the emphasis that I choose to take on, like with this project, which is like the keyword informative, like how to make information data collection process that usually happens in a black box, on the back end. How do we make that more transparent and explicit for the user? but without overwhelming them. I think that is the kind of tension that we not often find ourselves in as like someone who designs software. So civilized capitalism is a keyword that I mentioned in the beginning of the talk. I would highly encourage you to look into this book or listen to talks by Dr. Shoshana Zuboff. If you're unfamiliar with the term, but essentially it's talking about these, various types of pervasive techniques that tech companies are deploying to collect data in ways that might be completely not obvious to everyday users, right? So one of the things I should talk about is that information that we explicitly provide is actually the least important part of the information that they collect about us, right? The information they might be collecting is where were you when you sent this message? What other things did you look at when you sent that message? So this kind of relational analysis of where one location data or like the kinds of like purchasing habit or communication pattern, relationship with others, those are the kind of data that turn out to be more valuable than the data that you might be explicitly putting into a software. And so over here, then, like thinking about this like in the context of interface, has anyone here heard of this website called Darkpathers? I saw you nodding your head. Have you seen it?
I've briefly heard about it. It's basically a website collecting all the tricks the website or the softwares are like setting up for you.
Exactly. Yeah, so darkpathers.org. I definitely encourage folks to take a look at it. It's a website that shows you, that collects, that archives all the different kinds of, I would say, user interface design tricks that trick the user to do something that actually violate consent, right? Or consentful practice that we just talked about. So this is one example called trick questions. When the form trick you into answering a question that you didn't intend, right? Or when sneaking the basket, right? It's like agreeing to A, just because I want to buy, a URL doesn't mean that I also want to buy, this like all these bonus features or benefits that it's offering. But a lot of times, like through like visual tricks and through language or obscuring of language, these companies oftentimes would be able to get one to do something that they didn't want to, or being charged at the end of a free trial. That's kind of a classic one, right? And so I think for Togethernet, for me, there was a lot of thoughts that's, one of the premise is thinking about, okay, if it is possible for the creative industries to essentially develop a series of user interface design techniques that result in what I call the art of deception. There has to be a way to do the reverse and do the opposite and develop a series of techniques that is going to facilitate or foster consent. And so, but the question is how, right? And so, what does the software backend knows about us? That's the first question that I think I have to ask as I start building this software with my team. And how does the software front end express that knowledge? And there are many different ways to do it. And we'll talk about it a little more in the workshop. But one of the things that may be obvious is the idea of service agreement. I think service agreement is actually a really good example because nobody reads it. and the reason, my hypothesis for why nobody reads it is because it's not written for me, right? It's not written for us. It's not written for the user. And I'm talking about Facebook, obviously. I'm talking about Google. I'm talking about big tech that would throw you pages after pages after pages of legal document where a room of lawyers team up to write, to formulate terms in agreement that is really meant to protect the companies, right? So of course I don't want to read it. I have been so trained and that has been so internalized for me on, because it's a waste of time. Because if I'm gonna use it anyway, it's, there's nothing about it that is really asking for my consent. So in terms of like thinking about service agreement, we thought about, okay, so what if we can, there's still, we want to restore service terms and service agreement back to what it's supposed to be. So what we ended up writing was this document called the Code of Consent. And this document is actually packaged into the software. So if one uses the software, it would always come with it. A software developer or someone who makes software are abided by the code of conduct that's listed up here. So the Code of Consent, in a way for us is really also an experimentation on how we exit the legal language, the kind of punitive language that oftentimes is couched in a way that is meant to protect the companies and not really feel inviting. It doesn't really feel inviting. It doesn't really make me want to. It doesn't really clearly address how it affects me, right? So these were. This was one of the attempts to think about how we exit those frameworks of thinking, and here are other examples, obviously, so how can we like describe these features, consent to archive, in ways that's going to be clear and accessible, and at times creative and playful and imaginative, right? And here's another example. So for like archival channel, another challenge came in on like, how do we describe messages that's stored on the server, like, and use a real life scenario that can be compared to that. So what we ended up with was posting on a bulletin board. So you posted a flyer on the bulletin board on the campus, day in and day out. Friends, acquaintances, and strangers pass by and pause and take a look at what you posted. Some of them might even take a photo of the flyer on their phone to share to other people, right? So this is very similar to like the kinds of like risk and threat one might face when they push your messages to the archive. Because from then on, anyone who has access to the address can look at it and copy and paste it somewhere else, and they can reproduce it or even change it, right? And it doesn't really go through, it doesn't necessarily fit the intention of why you wanted to store that message. So maybe this is where, hopefully, like it would like create a higher awareness, a kind of self-reflection before storing a message. Is this really necessary? Like, do I really want to archive this? Is it better if I just write it down, right? So yeah, here's just some examples of languages. And I think like now, I feel like we should get to Q&A pretty soon. But I think what I want to leave us with too is like when one is thinking about creating a software through the frameworks of consent, there are, and that lives online, right? That works in a networking context. There are 3 layers of consent that I think is important to consider. One is peer-to-server consent. What kind of information are you asking people to submit? How do you store them? Do you even store them? Is there a way to store as little information as possible? And also peer-to-peer, and that in a way is the hardest one, right? Because you can't really anticipate what people want to do, what they desire to do, and what they will do. So that is thinking about how to create an environment that is gonna make it easier to communicate in a consentful way. And server to server is thinking about, okay, so if there are all these different kind of archives that's online, there are ways for these archives to interact with each other. And how do we think about consent in that sense? Togethernet is definitely not there yet. And I think for me, it's thinking about like consentful software design is a combination of considering the relationship and like collision and possible like new ways of design that combines like thinking through a top-down process versus a bottom-up. So it's like a combination between like, okay, as a software designer, I am making some top-down decision, right? Without asking you, in the sense of like, I have decided this is gonna be peer-to-peer. I've decided this is gonna be less than 10 people. I have decided a multiple arrays of things that can be seen as top-down. But at the same time, how much space do you leave for participants to be able to decide how they use that space? Does that make sense? Here are some examples of some top-down decisions that, I think I also like think about it as like, I think the word top-down is oftentimes like seen as very negative, except I think that it actually can be very helpful to be, like more transparent or just, honest about what kind of decisions designers are making that are actually top down, right? And so for me, I think one of the things that Togethernet like really advocates was thinking about speed and rhythm. So because as an avatar, you have to move around, you have to walk around before you can even reply to a message or read other people's messages. The experience of running a workshop with it was that people just actually communicated in a slower pace. They talk in a slower pace, they exchange ideas in a slightly slower pace. They actually have more time to think before they respond to someone else's message. Also, things that happen almost, at the blink of an eye in like a regular messenger, such as like, writing a message and having it sent to the server, is happening here in an extremely slow way, right? So you have to go through this consentful process and collective decision-making process before you can even like achieve to a place of archiving a message. And so it's really thinking about like how, like if these things are, it's experiment too, right? I have no clue like how different kind of communities would react or interact with this differently. But the kind of like lineage that I'm following is that if the speed of a software is being slowed down, it is more likely that people have more time to think before they reply and more time to consider before they decide to archive a message. Another one is encampment size. So we started off with 12 people and we actually realized, 12 people is still a little too much. Let's go down to 10. And I still think 10 people is a little too much because to be able to come together and make collective decision together, I mean, we all know, like even in person, 10 people is a big group, and so it's, consent doesn't scale very well. Like people oftentimes will ask me like, oh, what about trolls? And what if someone just coming with bad intentions? And I personally think that, there are many different ways to deal with that, right? Like on bigger social media, you can ban a person, you can ban an account and kick off a person. You can block certain keywords so that it never shows up on your feed. The approach that we're taking is keeping the community really small, so that conflict resolution would be more manageable by the community, instead of taking a kind of more like punitive approach of like, let's just kick someone off and let them go somewhere else, right? And so another top-down decision is making sure that the software has to contain a code of conduct. So you're required to include a code of conduct for your community when you use it. That's also kind of like ensuring that people who are using the software are more likely to be value aligned and intentional about thinking about consent. And the last one is open source. The bottom up sort of like contribution that we are hoping to get through Togethernet is, different kinds of facilitation styles, right? Like we're not necessarily managing or like, overly designing like the different possible ways the space can be facilitated, and also decision-making methods. Like right now, all the decision-making methods are like with consent to archive is unanimous. And that is the decision we made for the template. But at the same time, we're really hoping like people who remix the software might come up with, other types of ways to make decisions depending on, a kind of self-assessment of who they are and what they need. And also conflict resolution, right? I think through like the experience of creating the software, like I found this like very fine line between trying to build a software environment that might be more prone to consentful communication versus crossing that line of starting to track and starting to surveil, right? It's like there's a fine line between that, like, just like making a space so that it's slow and it communicates in a very specific way versus when you begin to start adding numbers and start finding ways to flag people or be able to say, oh, this person had violated something 3 times. And therefore we have to find a way to bend this IP address, right? That is technically totally possible. But it does like start to, I think that line is quite interesting when it becomes like crossing a certain line, even though technically it might not be very hard to start like tracking people and surveilling people. And it retreats back to this kind of punitive system that is oftentimes utilized by social media that have to deal with, thousands and millions of people. And so that is the end of the presentation. I would say again, software really relies on community. And so as this project grows, it's really important to, think about how to find the right people to use it, not the right people in terms of like technical proficiency, but people who understand the value of the software and what it's trying to do. Thank you. So,
are there any questions or clarifications in the chat maybe that somebody wrote?
We had a comment that the concept of a digital body presence is incredibly cool. And I was thinking actually about this idea of reversibility. So once something is put into the cloud, how would that, outside of kind of like the right to disappear, the right to kind of like not be kept permanently up in the cloud somewhere on the internet, how would that actually, how do you see that working?
Well, that's the hard, I think that's actually one of the hardest part that I think, that was the part of reversibility that for me would take decades to address.
Yeah.
because building a server really shouldn't be that hard. Like I really wish it's not that hard. And a lot of, if one were to like start looking up tutorials on how to set up your own server at home, for instance, it's, you kind of immediately jump into tutorials that are highly technical with languages that are not accessible. And in comparison, like when we look at some of the tutorials or, where we're at when it comes to learning JavaScript or learning, creative coding through like P5.js or processing. I don't know if people here are familiar with that. No. Yeah, it's so P5.js, just to give a plug, it's a JavaScript library for artists and designers to be able to learn code in a very accessible way and inclusive ways. And I think P5.js and processing, which is the predecessor of it, we're using like the Java language, has done a really great job on, making programming very welcoming and accessible. And I think that's, that kind of work needs to happen on the server end. It needs to happen on the hardware end. And without that, and those work took, decades to build, right? So I think to answer your question, though, there aren't a lot of satisfying solution when it comes to just setting up a server on our own, on the internet, and have it live on the cloud somewhere, because yes, like a lot of servers might still be exploiting the data that you store on it in some ways. So for me, the next step of this project is starting to build out some step-by-step tutorials on how to set up your own server at home. But also knowing that, at this stage, that work those tutorials are still going to appear quite technical. And that's the unsatisfying sort of part of working in this realm. Yeah. Are there any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious about like the download stuff, because you only allows users to download them as HTML, but like why not PDF or TXT? Because it's more like accessible for people who don't know like Markdown HTML.
I think that's a good question. We definitely have thought about the different possibilities. I think that if we have more time, like meaning like, maybe in like the next couple phases of the updates, I can definitely imagine providing more options in terms of, we actually started with a TXT and thought, oh, like, we get all these like chat log TXT from Zoom all the time. Do people really look at it? Like, it's, if the intention is community archive, wouldn't it be more fluid or intuitive if it's HTML page, and kind of like suggesting, I think it's trying to suggest that, like people can be hosting this as web pages, but I also hear that it's not necessarily accessible to everybody. So yeah, it definitely has its downfall. I think, yeah, if with more time, I would love to have those different options. Yeah, sure.
We actually have a question from the chat. IO is asking if Togethernet is for communities that understand the importance of consent and the importance of protecting our digital bodies. How are we able to identify who those communities are?
That's a really good question. The way I do it is here. Let me just make sure this has attention. This is how I personally do it. So this was a series of workshops that we launched at our software launch. So usually when you finish a software, a kind of like conventional, traditional thing to do is you would give a demo. And I think some of those like, kind of Silicon Valley expectation of the outcome of those demo is to wow people, right? It's like you're supposed to perform something and people are really like, wow, that was so cool, or I can do that. I want to do that, And so I think for us though, we really wanted to exit the framework of the demo and what the meaning, the cultural baggage of a demo. So instead we ran a series of workshops where Togethernet wasn't even the center of the focus. So this series of workshops was on different topics of consent. So just want to name names here. Dorothy R. Santos ran a workshop discussing biomedical consent with a group of people, a group of like less than 15 people, I think. And we also had Kimberly Springer, who's actually from the oral history library at Columbia, and gave a workshop on oral history and its relationship to consent. And the lower left, Shanae McLean-Holloway gave a workshop on consent in relation to sex and intimacy. I gave one on consent and data. So our kind of like goal was that we, through these series of workshops, through like launching these workshops and having people having those discussions using Togethernet, but talking about topic on consent, we're going to attract a lot of people who are just interested in thinking about consent generally, and like having those people as the seed of the community, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So I would say, yeah, through like running public events and workshops and being very explicit with like in language in terms of like what kind of workshop this is, what is the value that we're trying to advocate or underline. I would say that's how I would approach it. Are there any other questions? Yes.
I personally really like the idea of that in the main interface, there's kind of like a lag between how you can move your cursor and how your actual block moves to a certain like dialog box to see the message. So I'm just wondering that how like what other features of the main interface you're looking to like add in the future to make it more like a real like physical space.
I really like that question. I've never got that question before. I love it. So here's some things. Well, actually, this is not a good slide. Hold on, let me see if I can find a better slide. Actually, maybe I can talk about a little bit about like the evolution of the interface. This was gonna be part of the workshop, but I can just like maybe show a slide or two. This is the very initial version of Togethernet. Like it looked totally different, right? And it was really following the convention of like a vanilla text chat. So the idea was this was going to be peer-to-peer. Peer-to-peer is in the dark, archive is in the light, and just like this like very simplistic kind of visual representation. And I think the problem that I was encountering here was that the idea was like, okay, so every single feature that people use at every single moment is going to be accommodated by like a kind of message that they can toggle on and off. So when they're typing the peer-to-peer mode, it would like tell you like what the peer-to-peer mode does, and like give you all the information on like the kind of data privacy benefits and risk of using either any one of those things, and just kind of like it's almost like an annotation, an augmented message on every single thing you use. That very quickly, I personally realized that very quickly like stopped working because the messages had to be really long to like fully express what was happening, and it was becoming very overwhelming. A lot of the considerations, how do you fit all these things inside a browser space, right? And also the language was so technical that I just felt like people who are not interested in this are just not going to turn it on. And people who are interested in it, might, be the kind of people who are reading this, on Mozilla blogs anyway. So it wasn't very clear how I deal with this issue of like text overloads and having like enormous amount of technical language on the interface, and it didn't feel fluid. And so it like very quickly, the next phase, I was like, okay, I have to not think about this in such a literal way, like in the sense of like, how can I use the user interface itself is deceptive, right? Like the text vanilla chat itself is come from the tradition of like a written document, right? And like what is happening on network level is not visually represented in any way, right? And so how do I show that we are in a peer-to-peer context? Each person are in fact a pair, and we have this direct connection lines with each other through interface design. So that interface design like shifted into this. So the idea initially was like, okay, there's gonna be all these different pairs, and they're gonna have like dotted lines that connects them to show that they are connected through a peer-to-peer protocol. And that each of this peer is going to, be able to like send out all this like little bubble message and be able to walk around and still like leave messages around, but the peers are going to be connected through these lines to show the connections. So I think for me, to answer your question, I would love to bring some of, I would love to make the peer-to-peer like infrastructure and the way it is behaving at every moment of the experience to become more transparent, to like visually represent that more on the front end. And I think we've done some work to do that, but there's always spaces to improve.
So this is like a future version, or
this was a past version.
Oh, why was that eliminated?
What's that?
Why was that like rejected?
Good question. This was eliminated because
imagine if like someone started writing a paragraph, and if we have like 10 people, if we have 5 people here, multiple people are writing like larger, like 2 sentences to 1 paragraph. All these boxes are gonna overlapping with each other, and it's just gonna look visually very chaotic, not comfortable. So we actually eventually shifted to this, right? So finding a middle. So yes, there's going to be moving avatar, and instead of having all the dialog boxes just kind of appending next to them, we're going to make them all consolidate in the same space and only pop up when you walk right next to the message. So yeah, it's all kind of like different kind of trade-offs and thinking about what is lost and what is gained by going with one way versus the other.
We have a question and a comment from Ender Minyard, who is first asking, what P2P protocol did you try to use? I have tried to use IPFS and DAT/hypercore in the browser, but it was quite difficult. And then they say, was the issue merging conflicts for people talking at the same time? You can use auto merge as a CRDT if that is a problem.
I think I get the first question, but I'm not sure about this.
Second.
So the second question I'm a little confused by, but we played around with Webrtc. We used this library called Peer.js as a starting point during the prototyping process, and then we shifted into Webrtc. And I think that was a really attractive protocol, and I think I would be very interested in possibly, like reassessing the differences between using Webrtc and that. But again, agreed that is very difficult technically it's quite difficult. And also it's unclear, it wasn't totally clear to me how well it's going to be maintained, how many good documentation is going to get developed as time goes on. So I think it was an assessment of like thinking about like the technical high bar of that protocol, but in combination with a lack of documentation that was available online to address my specific needs, that we decided to go with Webrtc. But what was the second question again?
Hi, the person in the chat said I can unmute if I want to clarify. So the DAT protocol actually renamed themselves to the Hypercore protocol. So that might be why you can't find documentation. And they have a Discord that you can join if you have questions. And the second question is about actually quite a technical issue. I didn't realize that it was so technical, but you don't have to go into it. And DAT actually uses Webrtc. Both DAT and Pure.js just use Webrtc under the hood to connect peers.
Cool. Yeah, that's good to know. Yeah, I know about Hypercore a little bit. I think for me, like the question of what tools or even what approaches to write this code in this template was a really interesting one. Again, I wasn't the lead software engineer, right? I was in communication with Yaqing, and so to make sure that I understand every single step of it. But I think that Yaqing made a couple decisions that was very explicit that I thought was really, really interesting. For instance, some of the parts of the code, if you go to the GitHub repository and taking a look at that, we actually use jQuery to create some of the animation. And jQuery is, it's almost like seen as a little bit outdated in some contexts, depending on who you ask. But I think at the same time, we were really interested in, not just writing something that works, that is going to like fulfill functions, but also using an external tool that is going to be as remixable as possible. So I think that was, that was the big part of the concern. Like, how can we like not overly complicate the software with the goal of wanting to shoot for certain kind, like essentially like, overshooting our goals. And because like whatever decision, whatever framework we decide to pick up, because initially like, I think Yachin was also thinking like, should we use React? Should we use, all these different kinds of frameworks that we can possibly use for this? And ultimately towards the end, we ended up with Webrtc, jQuery, and HTML and CSS. And the hope there was really so that, when we are running like remixing workshop, or if anyone decide to remix it, it can be, the tech barrier can be a little lower, hopefully.